Welcome to With Thunderous Applause, podcast where two friends get together and talk about the events and ideas that will shape our uncertain future. I am your host, and now I'm going to label myself a co-producer,
Oh, what?
Steve,
No.
along with my producer and co-host,
Co-host and
Zach.
producer. What's up, everyone? How are
It's
you
called
today?
it's called redundancy, right?
Yeah, there you go.
We both have a primary and a secondary role, and they complement each other.
Oh man. So what are we talking about today?
So after much what do you call that, procrastinating or intentional avoidance,
I think it's been a year. I think we might have brought this up in episode 2.
Yeah, so we've been talking about wanting to do a show about American Balkanization for quite some time. That day has finally come, and we are not able to touch on all the aspects that we could touch on. And so it's pretty kind of hard to produce the show and pare it down to just a kind of simple narrative. So we're going to start with kind of setting up the idea of national divorce, peaceful national divorce, or peaceful balkanization. And then we're going to discuss some of the reasons why that might be necessary. And then we're going to go into various historical other kind of formations to kind of explore this idea that land and territory are not necessarily fixed. We have very short cultural memories. Would you agree, Zach?
I would completely agree. Who remembers the Iraq War? Woo!
Oh yeah, shit! I forgot that happened. We just had 20. No, I'm just kidding. I don't forget that shit happened. But yeah, you're right. We forgot that George Bush was a fucking war criminal, right?
Now
now
we
he's
haven't arrested him yet or charged him
whatever.
with any crime, so we must have forgotten.
Yeah, he wasn't indicted, so he
No.
must have not been a criminal, right? Unlike
He's
Trump.
fine.
Which, speaking of which, Trump's indictment is part of the for me at least, a push factor that it's we should really probably talk about fucking American balkanization or the national divorce.
I mean, a lot of it is surrounded by him coming into office and everything that led up to that, and just the two or more Americas that exist within the actual America.
Yeah, and I would go so far as to say there's hundreds and thousands, or hundreds or potentially thousands of different countries or different ways, different territorial units that could be extracted from what's essentially the majority of the land mass of an entire fucking continent.
Right.
And
We are a
nowhere
massive
else,
state or country.
yeah, nowhere else on Earth is there such a large country. And people might be like, well, what about China? Well, China could also be balkanized as well, because they also have significant cultural differences across regions, biogeography, etc. There's parts of China that are deserts, right? Where not a lot of people live. So at any rate, we're going to talk about balkanization, and then we're going to kind of come into some ways of thinking about how we could do it. Because as you'll see in this first clip, and as we'll discuss once we show the clip, there are some very wrong ways to do this. It's not that I would say that our position and the position of the podcast, and correct me if I'm wrong, step in if I'm fucking making assumptions about how you think about it, but I would safely say that we assume that this is kind of there's a kind of inertia towards this. It is in many ways inevitable, whether it happens now or it happens 200 years from now, right?
Yeah, it definitely seems like it.
Yeah. There's a certain kind of instability of large organs. We talked about nuclear power, right? What is an unstable atom? It's an atom that's just too fucking big to where the various forces at work in it can't hold it together, right?
Right.
I think that's
Speaking
an
itself apart.
analogy. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now we have areas of the country that completely disagree on what they would say are fundamental ideas, whether that's abortion or, the rights of various groups of people. There's a lot of tension there that is trying to rip apart this country into smaller, more manageable, more agreeable parts.
Yeah. And, why not? Like, why not have this conversation? And why not begin to think about how we might be able to do it? Of course, like the way that history plays out, like in the present and in the very near future, like we can't predict it, right? There might be some kind of political alliance between two regions. We'd be like, you should govern yourselves, but those individuals, and ultimately it's the people who seize power over those
Hmm.
territories, may have some other kind of agenda, right? Like, oh, well, these people, we disagree on these things, but here's a reason that we need to work together. And so they'll be part of a territorial unit, even though we might think that they could be separate. Right. And we cut a lot of stuff on like confederalism and various ways of like organizing governance structures just
Hmm.
because we didn't really have time. And so we can go into those maybe in a future episode. But I do think there's a kind of inertia towards this. So we might as well have this conversation so that we have a better idea of how it might be done compared to how some people conceive of it. Let's
And
play a
just
clip.
having the idea in our minds is a good idea, because
Mhm.
otherwise the only other answer would seem to be civil war. And I don't want people thinking that, like, let's give you some alternatives.
Yeah, plenty of people are already fucking like pretty much think that's inevitable, and I don't.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do think what would you call that? Balkanization
Yeah.
or decentralization.
Or
Um
devolution, as it is titled in one of the
Devolution.
videos. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So
So,
let's start off
mhm.
with Chris and Evie's live stream. This is a Peak Prosperity, Chris Martinson. We've used his stuff before, and as I said before, super influential into how I think about the world. I took his crash course like shortly after the financial crisis,
Mm,
um, and when I kind of fell down the peak oil rabbit hole. So I've been following him a long time, and he's doing these Q&A kind of live stream things once a week with his partner.
yeah.
Now we're finally down to the final last bit of which is the idea of, is it time to discuss a national divorce? Casey Flores put this map together and sort of drew it at the county level, so it's not at the state level. Drew it at the county level and said, it might look like this, right? Notice he left all along the top border there. There's a northern corridor, so he hasn't bisected it, meaning there's a left and a, like I'm sure that those northern counties in Montana are going to be like, the hell you say?
That is interesting. Like, the red portion just has no access into Canada, maybe the tip of Idaho, without going through the Gray Nation. And that seems a little weird.
Yeah, you know what else is weird is that Chris Martinson is a person who thinks deeply about economics
Hmm.
and about how economic infrastructure is set up and how it functions.
Hmm.
And what do you see that? Oh, so there's a corridor. So technically they're still connected, but like, what are we going to do? Like, build a fucking train through a little narrow fucking thing to try and connect all this? Like,
Right, right.
there's no economic logic to it, which is, I mean, that's just a map. Maybe I don't know who Casey Flores is. Maybe someone
I
who
mean,
follows.
he says in a bit that he just kind of pulled it up and he doesn't necessarily agree with it. But yeah, I
Okay.
mean, it basically, the Gray Nation has all of its economic power in more or less New York and California, the Red Nation in Texas and Florida for all the people that want to retire. But yeah, let's
Yeah,
continue.
let's keep playing the clip and
Yeah.
then continue
I
discussing.
know. But this he was trying to think it through. And he also noted that, he left a Pacific access down there in San Diego on that little red down at the bottom. So the red states have access to the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and then the blue states, or whatever this national divide would be, anyway, that's just how he divided up. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's a starting point to have that conversation.
Is this based on any voting whatsoever?
I mean, this would mostly follow the voting patterns, except for that northern corridor.
Okay.
Yeah, allowing the if the divorced state on the left to traverse. If anyway, that was just sort of an idea. I've seen lots of
Anyway,
other different ideas, but
Yeah.
so a divorce happens. When does a divorce happen? It happens when you get hit with irreconcilable differences
Mm-hmm.
I like this part.
in a relationship. So the question becomes, would you rather have a civil war where everybody fights it out and there's lots of murder and mayhem, or do you just call an audible on the relationship and say, you know what, you people in New York, you be you. You guys, you know what? Charge the wrong people, flail around, make a mockery of the law, abuse your children, Go for it. You be you,
Yeah.
right? I don't want to have to fight you over that, and you shouldn't have to fight for your right to be that way. If they want to be that way, they should be that way. But they should not be in a position of forcing their same behavior sets on me if I don't want them.
Mm-hmm.
Pause.
Yeah.
So there's like there's a lot of shit wrong with what he just said. Um,
Go on.
that kind of like, oh, if they want to abuse their children, what the fuck do you mean? Like, oh, they're like
Right.
because of drag story hour or because of fucking mask rules? Because there's a lot of different things in is that child abuse, and to kind of frame it is like, oh, if you want to abuse your children, like
Yeah, it's a weird way, and it leaves everything up to question. And you kind of have to
coming
like, know him to know what he's talking about. And I don't.
right. Yeah, and coming from a cultural context where like one segment of society that I would not consider to be New Yorkers, obviously like New York City and upstate New York are fucking different worlds, just as Northern California and San Francisco, the
Mhm.
rest of Northern California and San Francisco are different worlds, right?
Right.
But like I would probably make a pretty safe assumption that there is the segment that wants New York to leave them alone also beats the shit out of their kids as a way of disciplining.
Oh, or doesn't give them vaccines, and then they die from easily preventable diseases. Proven vaccines.
Or riding around in the back of a pickup without a seatbelt, whatever.
Hey, I'm okay with that. I did that as a kid.
But my point is that when he is getting at a pretty kind of this irreconcilable difference is kind of like ideas of liberty, right? Like
Yeah.
and issue ideas about power over, power with, like how power is managed. And it's a legitimate critique to say like, why do these areas that are relatively small in terms of geographic footprint,
Mhm.
why do they get to tell us what to do just because they have more people, right?
Well, and then transversely, I think that's the right word. Why do geographically unpopulated areas, get to have such an outsized voice in how things go? And so it all depends on what your point of view is, what you think is wrong with the system. Living in a relatively big town, I have to wonder why places like Idaho and Wyoming get any votes at all. They're tiny. They have like 100,000 people. Like, what the fuck?
Bro, like there are a bunch of states that have less than 1 million people in them. I
Mhm.
think Delaware has like 800,000 people in the whole state.
Yeah.
You're like 800,000 people. Like that's like half of the metro area of one medium-sized city in California.
Yeah, and like I
You
think
know what I mean?
Utah has a smaller population than Los Angeles County. Maine has a smaller population than just Los Angeles, the city. you know?
Well, Los Angeles, the city is 3 million. So like there's a bunch
Yeah,
of states that have a smaller population. I think
yeah,
places like Wyoming also have very small populations.
yeah. And
Um,
so, I mean, I kind of get this. It seems like what most people are wanting is like, hey, I live in a geographically rural area. I want rural values. Why do I have to put up with all these coastal people in their big cities telling me how to live my life? And on the other side, you got people that are just like, hey, I live in a very dense area. I will be lucky if I see a tree this year. That's an exaggeration. But, why am I letting all these people with their farms and cows and sheep, determine like what my kids can and can't learn or if I can get an abortion? And so it's similar to that. Yeah.
yeah, let's keep playing this clip and we'll continue talking.
My brain's just playing around with the implications of a national divorce. It's like, whoa.
Well, it begins with recognizing that there are such things as irreconcilable differences. It begins, which might be, this is from Wikipedia, around divorce and marriage. Any sort of difference between the two parties that either cannot or will not be changed can be considered an irreconcilable difference. A difference that could be that of a difference in character, personality, belief, or some other personality trait. Right? So the question before us now at this point in time is, are we at a part of the national dialogue where we can just call an audible, lay down the weapons, and just say, look, have we just grown apart? Are we just so different in our orientation, values, beliefs, traits, personalities, all of this and that it's time to just separate? Do it amicably, do it as peacefully as possible. But it's the grand experiment of America is now broken. And I believe it got specifically broken by people who are trying to break it because they believe in their heart of hearts that in order to build back better, in order to have a great reset, you have to first tear everything down. It's a very childish, immature view because obviously by doing it that way, you risk tearing it all down and then it stays torn down and broken. It's a really stupid idea. You never tear something down and then build the better model. You do what Bucky Fuller said. If you want a system to change, you don't tweak it, you build a better model. And then people will beat a path to your door. That model will win because it's superior.
Because you build the model, a superior model, build a better mousetrap,
Yep.
right? If you want to sell the mousetrap. Well, there's a lot to that that's hard to swallow for me because, like, first of all, being like, oh, they want to tear it down, and he uses language that is appealing to the almost half of his subscribers or more, all flooded in because he was critiquing COVID policy.
Yeah, I do remember that.
And he has shifted significantly because, and also like he's just times change, right? And we are a product of our environment and how ideas change and how personal circumstances change. So I don't doubt that as he became older, he became more conservative. But there is that kind of like tossing bones, right, to particular segments. Build Back Better is a fucking political slogan, and like literally, like none of it has come to pass. Like it's just literally a campaign slogan. So to like leverage that and be like, oh, they want to tear it down and build it back better. Like that's not what that means. Build Back Better is like make America great again. It's literally a meaningless fucking political slogan, in my opinion. But like, you know, I don't know, man. He's tough to follow sometimes, but like I do think that generally people have similar ideas. People want security, people want freedom, people want their children to grow up safe and happy and have clean air and clean water. Like those, I think everybody agrees. And in a lot of ways, and they talk about it later or earlier in this live stream, I forget, they do talk a bit about how like the media contributes to manufacturing division, right? Matt Taibbi wrote a book that I haven't read. Too long, didn't read. I just learned that today. Nerd. No, I haven't read Hate Inc. yet, but like his central thesis, I've seen a bunch of interviews where he talks about it. His central thesis is that like the media basically is a major contributor to, and I think Evie says it later in that clip, says like maybe the media should have to like the corporate media should have to pay for this process, right? Like fund the process of national divorce.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, the thing is, like, they will put on what gets eyeballs, and what gets eyeballs is division and ire. And there's no better, you know, division and ire than hot button topics. You know,
that's right.
Hey, people are talking about this. Let's talk about that. And it's like that's cool and all, but like, why do you all have either the same or completely opposite opinions? Why is there so little like talking a different talking point?
Man,
yeah, it's kind of depressing.
Cool. So that's the end of that clip. I do agree with him though that we should do it peacefully. Back to the map.
Yeah, I don't want to fight a fucking war or
what's that?
I don't want to fight a fucking war or have, you know, people younger than me go fight a war. Like they've already got a shitty deal, you know, anyways, as young people. The world's falling to shit around them. And it's like, hey, go die so we can redraw some lines on a map.
Yeah. And to before the map, to come back to this concept of breaking things down. Unfortunately, like the building of a better model is not practical because existing institutions and power structures don't permit you to try a different model.
Oh yeah, they smack you down the moment that you try anything different. You can look all across the world in areas that America has brought democracy to and see that new ideas are frowned upon.
And what's interesting too is a lot of fucking conservatives in California live in unincorporated areas. Like, and so they don't even have control over how their taxes are spent, except that they get the county government and they control power there, right? Like, but ultimately, like where I grew up in a little town called Forest Hill, very, very, very different needs and desires than a place like Roseville. Well, Roseville is a city, and so it has a bigger tax base, but Roseville's also in the same county. So, like, you have needs going unmet some places because of these overlapping structures, right? Like the city within the county, but like technically different bioregions. One's down towards the valley, low elevation foothills, and another one's up in the conifer forest, et cetera, so forth. But anyway, I think that whole build, like, we just need, you can't, a national divorce is breaking it, right?
Yeah.
A
Well, the
civil war
whole
would be
him
breaking it too.
comparing or him talking about Build Back Better, and you mentioning like Make America Great Again. It's all there in the title. Make America Great Again. It used to be great. I'm a conservative. I want to keep things the way they were. Build
Yep.
Back Better is saying I want to progress towards something different. And so
Mhm.
it's very simple, 3 or 4 words, and you've summarized an entire way of thinking.
Yeah. One looks back, one looks forward.
Yeah.
Both are bullshit. And
And
both are
both are ignoring
slogans
what's
that
going on
don't
right
change.
now.
What's that?
Both are ignoring what's going on right now
Yeah, exactly. Come on,
to
dude.
the
Like,
detriment of everyone.
Biden going to fucking whatever Rolling River or whatever it's called in Mississippi, where there's tornadoes last week. Dude, there's been so many fucking tornadoes. We needed to do a news update, but we just don't have time.
Tornado in Los Angeles County.
Yeah. Well, we
I
get
didn't
them
think that
sometimes
shit
here
even
in
happened.
California, in the Central Valley too. But
I've never heard of it. That's amazing.
yeah, they happen. Yeah, convective activity. But at any rate, like, Biden goes there, right? To visit a disaster zone, right?
Mhm.
And talks about climate change and all these like bad things, like literally like 2 weeks after he's like, you know what we need? We need to build more oil drilling infrastructure that has like a 40-year service life. What we need to do, oh my God, your community is, and we need to stop climate change. That's why I passed this thing to fucking subsidize like electrification, but I'm also still fucking pumping oil, right?
Yeah. And
So, oh,
authorizing new drilling in Anwar up in Alaska.
Yeah, exactly. Tell me how that's better. That's the
Build
exact same
back the
fucking thing
same.
we do.
It's too many words. Yeah, you gotta. He wanted 3 words, so it was more succinct than "Make America Great Again." So he was like, "Build back better" instead of "Build back the same." Brevity.
All right, let's move on to our next clip, dude.
Yes.
Oh, that
Yes.
map.
Oh
We'll
yeah.
talk more about it, but it's really fucking idiotic to be like, who votes for Republicans? All right, we'll make our own country. Like,
Yeah.
I think I might have mentioned in one of our previous podcasts having a conversation with my parents, or where I talked about the Kansas experiment, because they were talking about the state of Jefferson and all this. I think I might have mentioned this. No? Okay. But my point being is that, like, oh yeah, let's take all these people who think the exact same and have fairly radical ideas, right, in terms of like economic policy and stuff, and then yeah, sure, go ahead, do your thing. They tried it in fucking Kansas and it blew up. It didn't work. um and also, like, the there's like diversity of ideas is so fucking important, and I think that's part of the problem, right, is that we're not communicating, um and our ideas aren't being shared. Ideas are being rejected a priori based on some perception of what you believe rather than the idea itself, and that's where a lot of this political tension has come from in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely agreed. Well, I mean, you get questions. I don't know if you bother with it, but I have an app on my phone called YouGov, and they do
Yeah.
like daily quizzes. They do, other ones, but like it seems like they're always, bringing up questions like, oh, if your child were to date someone who had, democratic values but didn't really, participate in politics, what would you think? Or, if it were, a Republican, etc. And it's just like, it really is kind of trying to get you to think that if you know someone's voting, you know someone. And it's like, no, people vote for different sides for different reasons. Like, not all Republicans are racist. Not all Democrats are like, super into, drag shows and stuff like that. Like, it's a very wide spectrum, and we don't acknowledge that. And it makes it
It's a
easy to,
caricature. Again,
yeah, yeah,
Neat ink, right? We've created caricatures, and politicians are guilty of it, right? They feed into that. It's easier to dismiss someone for some kind of perceived flaw or manufactured flaw than it is to
mm,
engage in the difficult work of having a civil, constructive conversation
yeah,
about ideas and problems. I'll tell you one quick anecdote before we move on, unless you have a thought after mine.
yeah,
Um, I was outside a city council meeting one time, and we were there advocating for humane treatment of the unhoused, and other people were there to say, God City, you need to do something about people sleeping in tents because I don't like seeing poor people. Um, and afterwards, it's like, you guys, I think I said somebody confronted me about something, or we were just like kind of talking, which is nice because when you're in certain spaces, especially in large groups, then it's like us versus them. Where if it's just like one on one, even though we both came from different camps, like we could still have a conversation because like the environment is less threatening, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah. Like, you don't
you,
get people egging each other on, as
right?
so often happens when you have any more than two people in a room.
Or you are presenting your idea in a certain way to get the other people in your in group to respect you more, or to be like, yeah, right, and to give you congratulations, or however it works, right? Like, but anyway, we had that conversation. And it's like, yeah, dude, this is a serious fucking problem. It's like, oh, you actually recognize that there's a problem? I'm like, yeah, we all do. But it was a characterization that, like, oh, you just want there to be junkies everywhere. And it's like, no, we would prefer there not to be junkies everywhere. That's why we're trying to figure out a way to deal with the problem that does not include locking people up or using cops to fucking make their lives miserable.
Right.
And what's ultimately a strategy of kill them by exposure. It's just make them live on the street long enough that they fucking die because it's really hard on the body.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and so you want to slow murder them. We're trying to figure out a way to avoid slow murder, but that doesn't mean that we don't see a problem, right? Like, yeah, fucking piles of garbage is awful, but like, as I commonly joked, like, I can drive by some houses that have overflowing garbage cans, and the only difference between that overflowing garbage can and that pile of garbage there is that that person with the garbage can has a fucking house. So you don't see the garbage, but like the waste is still a problem, whether
Yeah.
you see it or not. Right?
Yeah.
Like, at any rate.
Well, like, I went with Rachel to one of her appraisals because it was an empty house and she hates going there alone,
Mhm.
and she had good
Rightly so.
reason
You got
to.
to get her a gun.
Yeah.
I'm just
She
kidding.
wants
That's
to shoot.
topic for
Yeah,
another day.
she wants to shoot. But not people, just targets. But no, like, going in
Paper
there, she
people.
was right. Like, she was right, because like, that area, she was told, "Oh, there's a key and it'll be over here." And she looks and the key's not there, and it's like, "Oh, fuck. Like, somebody already found this key."
Mhm.
And I got into the house. And like, you go into the house and it's a hoarder house. Like, not as bad as some of the ones on, on the TV show, but it was bad enough that it was like hard to walk around. And like, yeah, so you can either have a horde out on the street or you can have a horde in your house. You just don't see one. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Like, happens
Yeah.
everywhere.
Same with the examples of substance abuse that we've given multiple times on this podcast already, where
Exactly. I abuse
the
my
people who go get
substances in
wine
private.
drunk every day after work,
Yeah.
that's socially acceptable because they go home. But if you're a hobo and you want to drink a fucking like brown bag of tall can, like, that's not acceptable.
Yeah. For some
Yeah.
awful reason. All right.
Next clip.
Yep.
What are causes the evolutionary movements? Ethnocultural forces, that's unit 3. Spatial forces, which we'll talk about briefly here in a minute, and then economic forces,
Can you move yourself
which
to the
is
top?
pretty obvious in
That was
Spain and Catalonia.
social
So
forces at the bottom.
let's look at ethnocultural to begin
That's a
with.
good spot.
If you have multiple ethnicities, multiple nationalities, multiple religions, multiple languages within a certain region, it's going to cause problems, usually. Not always, There are a few cases like Switzerland, where they have like 5 national languages, where it doesn't seem to be too much of an issue. But Belgium has issues with this. Obviously, Yugoslavia had issues with this. You're going to watch a video on that here in a minute, and many other countries have issues with this. Scotland, long history here of religion, Catholics versus Protestants, languages with the Celtic languages versus Germanic languages. Not to mention just simply different ethnicities to begin with. In Cyprus, you have Turks versus Greeks there on the island of Cyprus. Half the island is occupied by people of Turkish descent, half the island is occupied by people of Greek descent. One is Orthodox, one is Islamic, and obviously different languages. So
Pause
this
there.
causes problems.
Yeah, one thing about that kind of ethnocultural devolution, like how do you like what is your immediate reaction to that as a force, a de-evolutionary force in in the context of the United States?
Well, I mean, I would say that religious wise, that leads to issues or most countries with monotheism, because monotheism tends to dictate, everyone is on board with the same belief, or you're part of an out group and perhaps even an enemy. And we might have a maxim from our God to, deliver you,
Kill the infidels.
kill the infidels, or, deliver you unto God by, by preaching and converting you. And so unfortunately that means that the United States has a whole bunch of religions that are all very similar in origin, where there's a single God, and most of them do say spread your religion, have a lot of kids so that the religion is automatically spread, and don't appreciate infidels, even though Christianity doesn't call them infidels. It's what they are. So yeah, I mean that's a big pressure. We all tend to share approximately the same.
Real quick. So you're saying that religion is a significant factor in the national divorce?
Absolutely, yeah, because you have a lot of areas that are basing their politics on their religion, and then a lot of politicians that are absolutely willing to use that weakness against them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of politicians, they're electing people who genuinely believe the same shit as them. In my own city council, we have fucking like pretty right-wing people who are not like devout in that sense. I don't know how often they read their Bible. I get the vibe that they don't read it much, with how much falsehood they spew, right? And how little they reflect the values of fucking Jesus, right? Like,
Right.
Jesus basically told you the opposite, so you're clearly not literate with your own Bible. But like, it doesn't fucking matter, right? But uses religion and church and the big box church, in the kind of like evangelical, or I don't want to say Christian fascist, but definitely elements of that,
Right.
edging on the line of Christian fascism, and they use it because it's a solid voting block that will always turn out for you, and so you can just be like fucking. Do you remember when that Trump clip? Not to again to talk about Trump. I don't give a
The
fuck.
upside down Bible.
Well, yeah, someone's like, "Oh yeah, what's your favorite passage?" He's like, "Oh, I like all of them." Like he carried around a Bible for like a photo stunt, and then was like, "Yeah, I can't really choose a favorite."
Yeah.
Which is like, well played. I mean, he knows what he's doing, right? Not a stupid man. At any rate, yeah, I think that definitely part of the tension in the United States is based on ethnocultural. A lot of that is the coasts tend to be considerably more diverse, culturally and religiously, and that's just what happens when large amounts of people get together. Right, you're going to have differences, right? So I do think that there's a part of that tension is ethnocultural. I do think it is not prejudice or ignorant or otherwise kind of demeaning to acknowledge that like the middle of the country is predominantly white, as you mentioned, predominantly Protestant, right?
Well, yeah, and that can be like traced to or to historical reasons.
Patterns.
Basically, a whole lot of people immigrated from east to west, and they were a shit ton of white people and a lot of Mormons. They settled along the way to the west coast, and then they don't have a whole lot of like economic action going on, and so it's pretty much the people whose great great grandparents settled down there. It's their descendants who are predominantly white, and there's no reason for anyone to immigrate there. Like there are no job opportunities. Sure, I could be a poor Californian or I could be a poor hmm, Dakotan. I won't say which one, but
Well, I mean,
that
but
doesn't make
then
much of
you
a
go
difference.
like Iowa City is fairly progressive, and you can kind
Hmm.
of go into these other places where like it is mostly rural, but there are still cities which have a fair degree of economic activity and cultural
Right,
diversity.
and that,
And
yeah.
yeah, but I guess we don't need to dwell on it too much. This is obviously like a teacher. So it's
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
not the best, but I thought it really kind of added into the question like, what are some of the reasons um, this happens? And I think the ethnocultural definitely has a kind of like, there's a definite element of fear among more traditional white Christian families that demographics are changing. And you
Hmm.
can just go to fucking Fox News or any other thing, right? Like conservative circle, and it's evident that like they fear cultural diversity. I don't want to say fear in the sense of like they're scared of it, but there's definitely just kind of like I think it's human, right? I don't know. um
Tribalism, yeah.
yeah, we're kind of almost wired for it in some ways, so I don't begrudge people for believing or
Well,
being uncomfortable around a lot of diversity, but
I think the number is 150, and there's also a mirroring effect. The 150 is supposedly the number of close contacts that any one person can
gun bark
have and
number.
maintain. Yeah,
Yeah.
and maintain a reasonable closeness with them.
Mhm.
And then the mirroring effect, where you like to see what you see when you look in the mirror in other people,
Mm.
and so it's
I
hard
hadn't
for
heard of that.
people. It's not well known or well talked about because unfortunately it does kind of reinforce the idea that we might be wired for bigotry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I
And
mean, we are.
yeah. Well, people don't like to talk about it. Like there are some things where you try to talk about it and people are just like, I don't even want to hear that. And it's like, but there's much to be learned from this, and we're going to have to at some point learn how to like bypass our hardwiring if we want, if we want to make, progress towards something greater.
Or alternatively, we can just acknowledge that prejudices will exist and make legal institutions and social and cultural institutions that counterbalance that and ensure that that prejudice doesn't turn into structural oppression
Right.
of groups that are out groups or whatever.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so there is an ethnocultural dimension to this tension and that prompts this discussion of national divorce. Let's carry on.
Let me back up here. This is just a random map. You don't have to pay much attention to it. It just kind of shows you where some different evolutionary forces are at play in Europe. Economics, Catalonia, Spain. This is one of our case studies that you've been looking at. It's one of the first ones. Barcelona is the main banking center of Spain. It's where like a majority of the wealth in Spain is isolated and generated. And Madrid, along with several other regions of Spain, honestly like to siphon off their wealth from Barcelona. And people in Barcelona, particularly the Catalans, are tired of it.
Well, that's very similar to how, you always hear, red states talk about, getting away from the blue states and blah, blah, blah. But then when you look at the numbers, blue states are basically economically buoying up red states.
Oh yeah, or when people in the National Congress or in media are like, fucking Californians, fuck California. And you're like, yeah, you realize because like we definitely have our problems. I mean, I love
Yeah.
California.
Yeah.
It's a pretty fucked up place in a lot of ways, but like California's economic engine primarily in the more urbanized areas, not way out in the hills, right?
All right.
But in the Central Valley too, agriculture is a big part of our state's wealth. Um, But at any rate, like, we subsidize fucking places like Alabama
Tennessee, yeah.
and Tennessee and Wyoming. Like, we disproportionately pay. You want to complain that there's too much power? Sure, we can have a conversation about like how to distribute power more evenly. That's not a Republican form of government, which is ultimately what you're constantly reminded of. We don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. It's like,
Yeah.
well, a Republican form it's a form of democracy, right? But the Republican form of democracy is also about concentrated power. It's about maintaining hierarchies so that a small number of people can command the vast amount of the resources, right? And the way our system works is that then some people who are in more economically productive regions, again, not because of their ingenuity or anything like that, it's just a fact of history. Some of it is decisions that are made, a lot of it is just kind of happens and no one's really in charge, right? But yeah, we
Lost train of thought.
subsidize.
Yeah.
That's the long
We
term.
subsidize the poor states.
And that's fine. So there is some economic, but like not the other way. So that might be something that coastal people, so like ethno-cultural, you might see the center for ethno-cultural reasons want to split from the coasts, right? But the coasts might in turn say we want to separate from the middle because we are tired of not being able to determine where our wealth is directed because
Well, I
we're
mean,
too busy
worse than
sending our wealth off to these places that are not as productive. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, I mean, worse than that though. You're basically giving these places money, and then they turn around and attack your beliefs. And it's like, yeah, why the fuck should we continue, to go along with what we're doing? Like, okay, we're taking our money and our ideas. Best of luck to you, but don't try to invade us.
Yeah, we need some kind of system because what they're going to do is do the Kansas experiment again because they didn't learn. And by they, I just mean like if the middle of the country split off.
Yeah.
And then they're going to be like, oh, look at all this economic growth because we have all this business, but like their workers are going to get paid shit wages,
Mhm.
right?
They're not going
And
to
it's going
tax
to
their
kind of devolve
businesses.
into even closer to slavery than we already are.
Oh, I
And then
mean,
they'll pollute like crazy. Go ahead.
Elon Musk has already talked about, doing corporate cities in Texas near his production factories that he's moving out of California.
Yeah.
So
We are going backward. It's
oh yeah, for
really
sure.
subtle, but back to the company town and shit like that, we are definitely
Mhm.
already sliding backwards or
Yeah.
really moving forward in time, but cresting that hill. So developmentally, we're further down
Yeah.
while still moving forward.
It's another
It's a
dark
common
age,
theme in the
I'm
show.
sure.
All right, so economics matter. Next.
And they have been demanding more independence, and they have been graded at different times in history. They've had higher levels of independence. They used to be their own independent kingdom, actually, which hopefully you saw that in your research. But in any case, spatial. This was weird because Hawaii actually they were an independent nation. They were a monarchy. Had a king and then a queen. When you get in U.S. history, you'll learn more about this. They were actually at the time of Pearl Harbor. They actually were a territory. They were not even a state yet. They just recently became a state. I think it was after World War II they became a state. But anyhow, today they are still spatially separated from the United States. They have a separate culture from the United States. Ethnically, majority of the people of Hawaii are different than the rest of the United States. And so there's a big nationalistic movement within Hawaii itself to regain their independence and sovereignty apart from the US, or at least to become a territory separate from the United States. This will probably not go through with Congress, but in any case, it is alive and well there. And if any of you have visited Hawaii, you might have sensed this at some point.
Yeah. Cool. So spatial, where does that fit into this picture?
I mean, a lot of the things that we'll go over shortly point out how, things like Cascadia, have tried to carve out, the what tends to be referred to as the left coast rather than the west coast, which I think is pretty funny.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
I
they
always
tend to
call
try
it
to
West
carve
Coast.
out these spatial areas that have like similar biomes and things like that. What is that? Oh, yeah, but they'll try to
My
carve out
bear
these like,
hugging California.
yeah, but yeah, we'll try to carve out these biomes and stuff like that. And I don't know, that oftentimes seems like a much better idea. Like instead of just making squares like we've done in the past, let's pay attention to, rivers and mountains, like we did way in the past. Like back in Europe, most borders look weird because it was based upon geographical features, or sorry, geological features. Yeah, geographical.
Yeah, 100%. So that's what I kind of was getting at, spatial, right? I think there is an element of spatial. They always talk about, oh, the coasts, right?
Right.
Well, the coast has a particular geography, right? It's near a large body of water,
Yeah.
right? It's near productive river floodplains, like et cetera, so forth, right? So there is a spatiality aspect to it. I think really it's not an idea of spatial independence that I think that's really kind of at work in the national divorce conversation.
Mhm.
Um, but it certainly exists, right? Like uh folks in the Rocky Mountains or folks in, like, let's say New Mexico, they have a really distinct cultural. So ethnoculturally, they're very different than Maine or whatever, right? But geographically, northern New Mexico might identify with Colorado because it's the Rocky Mountains, right? The
Right.
Southern Rockies. Um, and so there might be like spatial identities, there's place-based identities, right? That matters, but I think that would matter more in my opinion, should matter a lot more. And we're going to talk about that. Should matter a lot more in determining how to amicably split up the United States. Those spatial considerations should have more weight than these kinds of more cultural driven, oh, let's just take all the counties that voted for Republicans and make them their own country. That to
Right.
me,
Right.
to go back to the Chris Martinson thing, is, and it's generally how it's discussed too. And I think in some ways to make it dismissible, if that makes sense. Like
No,
it's
what do you mean
framed
by
as,
that?
oh, let's have all the counties that vote for Democrats be one country and all the ones that vote for Republicans be another country. It
Well, because it's a
becomes an
silly
idea
idea.
that's easy to dismiss because it's so fucking convoluted.
Right. Right.
But this idea of spatial de-evolution, I think, is super important because we already do. Like, we already, like, okay, Arizona and New Mexico and parts of Texas are all part of the United States, right?
Hmm.
And they're part of their respective provincial states, right? But at the same time, it's still kind of a frontier. Like,
Yeah, there's a lot of
when,
undeveloped land.
yeah, and it's not really useful for much. And
No.
it's too hard to police it.
Yeah, but we
I
try.
mean, for real though, it would be much easier to police where there's more people, right? Like, so pull border control up to Tucson and just block the highways,
And just
right?
let all the
Instead of
immigrants
trying to like
have all that.
hold this
Well,
imaginary line in the middle of fucking nowhere.
yeah, and it really is. I mean,
I
is
mean,
that the
there's border
definition of
towns.
scrubland? Is that what you would call that sort of area? Or
That's
just desert?
mostly desert.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
there's shrubs in the desert, but I wouldn't call it scrubland. It's not the same as like uh northeastern California, Oregon, Nevada, that corner there.
Okay. But
There's
yeah,
a name for it. It's a
but yeah,
plateau.
yeah. Oh, gotcha. Yeah, but I mean, my
Yeah.
point is like, yeah, like we have so much empty space, and if you just let people in and like maybe set up some jobs and stuff like that so they can start their own or start their own cities, like you could have free development, they would naturally want to make roads and government buildings and stuff like that, and it's still within the United States. Who cares if everyone there speaks Spanish?
There are already in California, there are communities that speak almost exclusively Spanish.
Yeah, you'll have a few people that can translate, and that's about it. Usually younger people.
Yeah, usually younger people, be bilingual. Older people, they don't need it because their social circles all
That's
speak Spanish. So fuck it.
that's fucking common here. in
Yeah,
Fresno.
100%.
Like, we got 500,000 people, and you got a ton of them that are just like, I'm old and I don't speak English, because it never needed to happen.
They never needed to it, because it's only now that communication is so rapid and so wide, and transportation are so widespread, that like you come into contact. Like if you grew up in a small fucking farming town in rural California, like on the edge of the valley, and you worked that land, and that's where your church was and all that shit,
Right.
you got no need. Everything
Yeah.
you need right
Yeah.
there.
We have a whole bunch of farming communities where the farm workers, maybe one of them knows English, or so he can understand Hefe, and then everybody else is just like, I don't really need it. I trust this guy to translate properly.
All right, let's move on.
Texas Republican Party Chairman Alan West proposed that Texas and other like-minded states should leave the United States and form their own nation, and there was even a bill proposed in the Texas legislature that would have held a non-binding vote as to whether Texas should leave America, but it failed to pass the committee stage. In addition to California and Texas, there are some less well-known independent movements. The Cascadia movement seeks to unify the Pacific Northwestern states of Oregon, Washington, and the Canadian province of British Columbia together as one nation. States outside the continental US, such as Hawaii and Alaska, have flirted with independence in the past. Alaska even elected a pro-independence governor, but these campaigns haven't really got off the ground. The long and short of it is that while independent states might occasionally flirt with independence, these are usually reactions to controversial political events, and support rarely holds. And even if it did...
That's the important part. Like, every time you have a controversial, like, presidential election, or when Roe v. Wade is revoked and all that, you get massive numbers of searches of people like, how do I become a Canadian citizen? And then it tapers off slowly over time back to the baseline right afterwards. Because people are like, it's a lot of work, never mind.
And I think that's really important context for discussing national divorce. Because what we set up at the beginning of the show was, hey, it's really important to have this conversation because it's inevitable. At the same time, we have a chance to plan for and figure out the best way, right, to devolve or to peacefully balkanize, or however you want to put it, right? But ultimately, most movements are emotional reactions,
right?
And they're not sustained. Something like the state of Jefferson, which wanted to be a state in the Union, not separate from, and they're quite explicit in saying, no, we're Americans, right?
That's still a huge part of our identity.
It's still a huge part of our ethno-cultural identity, right? But then when you look at the history of that movement, like, they wanted independence back like in the 1930s, and then World War II happened. And they're like, oh, we got to go fight the fucking Japanese, right? And I could see something similar happening where, like, there are more and more movements and groups of people discussing wanting to have territorial sovereignty and democratic control over their resource base. And then war with China happens and everybody fucking forgets about it because rah, rah, we're Americans, right? Like,
yeah, I could see that. Yeah, well, and that's just the sort of thing someone in charge of the United States would do in order to maintain cohesion and be able to extract maximal value.
Also, just a quick point to again go back to what Chris Martinson said, to be like, that was kind of a really dumb way to phrase it for him, because he's not a dumb man, he's pretty smart, but obviously, but him being like, oh, just build a better model. Well, people can't, like, it's even a place like Texas, which like has a culture of independence. They were their own fucking country for 10 years. Like, they were the only country for any length of time. I think the Republic of Vermont was like 6 years. California, we'll find out later, was like a month, right? Like, Texas was like 10 years. And so they have a cultural memory of that, right? And even they can't get it out of committee. It's not that it failed when it went to a ballot initiative or a general election issue where everybody gets to decide. And in those cases, a lot of people could be like, I really believe in it, but we're inherently conservative. even someone who wants it might not be willing to pull the trigger, just as they did with the Scottish referendum, right?
Mhm.
Hey, we don't want to leave the EU, so we're going to leave the UK instead and stay in the EU, which really made a lot of sense.
Mhm.
But even then, despite there being a substantive and sustained movement for Scottish independence, right? They still said no, we're going to stay, because there's a level of inertia and a kind of structural stability in keeping things the way they are. And so
And now they're
even
kind of fucked too, because like now they're no longer part of the EU, so they'd have to leave the UK, apply to the EU.
Yeah.
They'd almost inevitably get approved, but still, now there's extra
I mean,
steps.
yeah, the Republic of Ireland is in the EU and uses in the Eurozone too. So like, but again, Irish independence took a very long, sustained movement because and required political violence to make it happen, which is a
Lots of it, yeah.
topic for another day.
Odd topic for a previous day, actually.
Previous day.
The
We're gonna
appropriate
revisit.
constitutional amendment is unlikely to get through.
Mhm.
One last thing to note is that if, for example, Texas decided to leave because it thought the rest of the US was
I like
becoming
this
too
part.
liberal or Democrat, this would end up being self-defeating. Texas leaving would mean 40 fewer electoral votes for Republicans. In 2020, Trump could have won Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, but without Texas, he still wouldn't have won. In other words, Texas leaving would hand the US to Democrats. Equally, California leaving would hand it to the Republicans. Anyway, what about the idea of
Yes.
How much of this clip is left?
50 seconds or so.
Okay,
45.
great. Then I'll make my inserted point here.
Okay.
This is something I've heard. We're going to talk about CalExit briefly in a clip today.
Texas or Texas.
Yeah, Texit and CalExit. One of the things that was constantly brought up, and again, why there's not really a sustained movement for leaving, right, secession. First of all, they fear like, oh, we'll have to go to a civil war. It's like, no, not really, not necessarily, right? But the important one was like, oh, and then we'll abandon all these people. This was pre repeal of Roe v. Wade, too,
Mhm.
right? We don't want to leave and then leave all these good, people who we identify with because we share some political beliefs. We're just going to throw them to the wolves. And I'm like, my attitude about that was, it's not our fucking responsibility. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, it's not my responsibility to ensure that someone in Alabama, has access to the same things that I have access to. It's not my
That's true.
responsibility.
I mean, they could get out in the streets, get their heads cracked open for a little while, and get it back.
Precisely.
Like-
If they want it, and they need to defend it themselves.
Yeah.
Just like if we want something, we want independence, we have to be willing to defend it ourselves. But my point being is that that's just it's not creative thinking, certainly, because it's like, well, we know through historical examples that fucking boycotts work.
Mhm.
If you took the 5th largest economy in the world, California, and said, no, we're sanctioning you. All of the money that companies from Alabama are in banks in California, you no longer have access to that. If we were our own country, we could basically do all of that, right? Like,
Yeah, you can
okay,
freeze assets.
yeah, we're going to freeze assets. We're going to stop shipping you components. We have all sorts of like manufacturers of like pumps and various kinds of like high-tech agricultural implements. Guess what? You can't buy those from us.
Dude, we could
until
even
you
keep
fix your shit.
we could even keep the abbreviation for CIA. It'd just be the California Intelligence Agency. We wouldn't have to change shit.
We wouldn't have a CIA. Well, we probably would.
Yes, we would.
Discussing the political system is kind of one of the reasons why I'm like, fuck it. It doesn't really matter. But my point is that to frame it like this, well, if you leave, then what about all the other people that you identify with? The fact that we're identifying with political parties and that's the way this is framed really makes me mad, which is also consequently why I love Cascadia so much, because it's not. In some ways it is, but generally it's not, because it's so fucking stupid. Because guess what, dude? The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, right? And the Democratic Party was the party of fucking Andrew Jackson and
Mhm.
racists. And guess
You
what?
just
I
kind of
mean, the
flip flop
Democratic Party still is a party of racists, but that's another topic for another day.
We just hide
but
it
guess
with BLM.
around FDR, that switched. People's political ideals change. So to like make a fucking country based off current political ideas that are shaped with the internet and social media, and then to make these permanent long-term changes, not irreversible, not immovable, right? Certainly you could decide, okay, I want to be my own country. I don't want to be part of the rest of the fractured states of the US or whatever, right? It wouldn't necessarily be permanent, but it's still a really substantive, consequential change. And to do that based on how you feel right now when you're basically being funneled into fucking echo chambers is the dumbest thing in the world, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Any thoughts? Carry on.
Carry on.
With the US splitting up into Red America and a Blue America. Well, we're not going to stay on this topic for very long because, well, it's not going to happen. The first thing to say is that there probably isn't a legal way of doing this. If getting one state to secede legally is difficult, getting half the country to do so is nearly impossible. Second, for all the talk of red and blue states, America is probably more politically mixed than you think. All states are ultimately a bit purple. There's an amazing stat which really illustrates how mixed America is. Most people who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 actually lived in blue states. Yep, so even if all the so-called red states left, they'd end up taking less than 50% of all Trump voters. You get the point. While it might occasionally feel like it,
Yeah, okay, great. I should have just I didn't remember the last bit of that clip. I could have just gave my comments then. But yeah, exactly. It's a fucking stupid idea because you're like, oh, we're a red states, blue states, but like again, like Iowa
For
City,
now. Yeah.
right?
Well, and it's so transient and everything's a for now thing, and someone might come along and, make up a new party, that you like a little bit more. It's unlikely to happen with our current our political system, but it could happen. And then like, okay, then what? Now you're like, oh, well, now that party has almost no chance because I'm in, the red states of America, and making any change is really hard.
Yeah. All right, we got about 20 minutes left. I think we should be able to get through this, right?
Yeah.
Great,
So,
let's do it.
Onward and upward.
Next, Deseret, which could briefly call
Oh, and this is a bit upon temporarily existing, basically.
Yes. A history lesson on some other ideas of statehood or nationhood that existed within the territory of North America.
Yes, and I know half of you just tuned out, but please do wake up.
itself a country from 1849 to 1850, but the purpose of its creators wasn't to be a country, but rather a state recognized by the US. When Mormon pioneers settled in the area in 1847, it was a part of Mexico. Initially, the local church leader intended to apply for status as a territory or a state. The proposal encompassed nearly all of present-day Utah and Nevada, large portions of California and Arizona, and parts of Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon, although the actual area of control of Deseret did not include all of these regions. While attempting to be recognized as a state, Deseret was, in fact, somewhat of an autonomous state/country, and the US didn't really agree to the creation of the state as the Mormons intended. They thought it was too big, too ambitious, and weren't too eager to hand the rule of a full state to a religious institution. Thoughts of
Not just a religious institution, but a religious institution that had been chased west by the more established religious institutions. Yeah.
uniting it with California as a single state were considered, but as a compromise, the Utah Territory was created. In this map, we can see it in blue, compared to the dotted outline, which shows the territory the Mormons wanted to establish as their Deseret state. In addition, the idea of creating a state based on Mormonism began to fade away after the coming of the railroad, which opened the territory to many non-Mormon settlers. The flag they used is said to have been this one, similar to that of the United States, but in blue. I assume the bigger central star would be in representation representation of their desired statehood. The name derives from the word for honeybee in the Book of Mormon, and in the current Utah state flag, we can still see a beehive in representation of this historic temporary state.
Biogeographically, desert makes a lot of sense. It's basically the Great Basin.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
As far as how we structure a state compared to this stupid idea of like, I vote for Trump and you vote for Biden. What about all of us who didn't vote for either of them?
Well, and you can
Just
tell
men
they
without a
carved out.
country, to borrow a phrase from the biography of what's his fucking name? Kurt Vonnegut. His biography was titled "Man Without a Country," and it's great.
Yeah. They carved out that little bit of California so they could have access to the ocean. You can tell.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
California Republic, also known as the Bear Flag Republic, was an unrecognized breakaway state from Mexico that for 25 days in 1846 militarily controlled a part of what is today California. In June of 1846, 33 American immigrants in Alta California rebelled against the Mexican government. Mexican officials had been concerned about a coming war with the US and the growing influx of Americans into California, and it seems that the rebellion was secretly supported by the US to prepare a full-on invasion. This makes it seem that there was never a real intention of becoming independent, just autonomous and as a part of the US. Another thing that points to that idea is that the rebels only elected military officers, but no official civil structure was ever established. And even this military structure was then incorporated into the US Army just before the territory was incorporated into the United States. Their flag featured a silhouette of a California.
Sorry. He's going to talk about the flag. I don't know why a lot of these YouTubers really give a shit about flags. They love fucking flags. No, it was just, that's my understanding of history, is that there were people that were moving west into California specifically to kind of be a beachhead, basically. And I just thought it was kind of funny because it was like, and Mexico was concerned about all these Americans crossing their border, and it's just like, oh, Jesus, how times change. But it's legitimate, right? They're like, wait, what's going on? Why are there so many wealthy white people with guns coming into Mexico? Oh, God, they're going to fucking take it from us. Which is exactly what they fucking did. And I really like that little Uncle Sam. This was a 100% not by the United States.
Yep.
We had nothing to... I mean, Manifest Destiny, right? We talk about American imperialism, right? Manifest Destiny itself already was setting that pattern of like, that's a fucking coup, basically. Right?
Well, and it was a religiously based one again, an aggressively imperialistic religion.
Yeah, it's just funny because it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna send all these people there, and then look, a conflict. I guess we're in charge now, right?
Oh man, it's too bad we had all those military officers over there. Oh
yeah, it's not a coup in the proper sense, right? Like not overthrowing an existing government, but doing something intentionally to upset an order and doing it.
I'm sure that the people in that area that were established felt like it was a coup.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
That was pretty much the end, though. So
cool. Yeah, we don't need to talk about the bear flag. Oh wait.
Yeah. What?
Go back to that clip, unless you closed it.
No, I didn't.
Don't they talk about Rough and Ready right after this?
They do. Did you want to watch that? Okay. Damn it.
We do say California Republic.
Great name, I guess. What the fuck?
Okay, great.
Well, that's not very good at all.
I wanted to include that because I actually, Rough and Ready is where I got my permaculture design certificate course. Did my permaculture design course. And so I just thought it was interesting too, because like it's in Nevada County, California. It's not far from us. It's it's interesting. It's just rural area. There's not really a town. I mean, I guess there's kind of like some old-timey buildings, but it's not really a town proper.
Mhm.
But I just thought it was really interesting. I was like, I had never actually heard of that. I knew the Bear Flag Republic, right?
Yeah.
Because that's U.S. history and California history, obviously. I didn't know about Rough and Ready. And technically, Rough and Ready lasted as a movement. They declared independence for 3 months until they're like, okay, never mind.
Yeah.
Did they ever? And that's the thing, too, right?
Are
We
you
can
independent
say,
when you declare independence? Who knows?
no, you have to be able to use force to defend a territory.
Exactly.
And ultimately, that might have been easier back then when there weren't a lot of people and you
Yeah.
just needed 50 dudes with guns and a couple checkpoints, and you could have been like territorially, and it would have taken a year, 6 months or a year for the US to send cavalry, right? A cavalry regiment or company or whatever to kill those people and be like, nah, no, you're still part of the US, right? Like,
Right.
but you have to be able to defend it, right?
Yeah.
Territory.
Or at the very least, make a whole bunch of agreements so that you don't have to.
Right. Yeah. You have to be recognized. People have to believe you're sovereign to be sovereign. It's kind of like money, right? For money to have value, we all have to believe it has value.
Yeah, when we were doing one of our previous videos, I was reading, it was about the UN, and I was reading about all the countries that are in the UN, and more importantly, those that aren't. And a lot of them that aren't are just because not enough of the member countries agree that that's like an independent country that should have representation within the UN. They're like, no, you're basically a territory of one country or another, like they claim you. And if we say you're an independent country, then they're mad at the UN. And we don't want to do that. And you're too small to matter. So kind of like, Rough and Ready could declare itself independent and just keep itself independent in California, be like, fine. When we make the Cascadia, you can't be part of it.
Let's watch this Cascadia clip and then maybe call it.
Okay.
Because I want it to be done in an hour and a half, and we can save Watershed Democracy and the Matador Network's cultural regions, and maybe have a conversation about pulling that stuff on confederalism and other ways of organizing governance structures. And then discuss like ways of dividing it up as kind of like a part 2 sometime in the future.
Okay.
You like
I'll make
that?
sure
So
to
we'll talk
label
about Cascadia, and then we'll finish off with a song that I found that was really interesting.
And I'll label this part 1, so that way we have to you make a part 2 or feel foolish.
Yeah.
So, who actually belongs in Cascadia? Since Cascadia exists more so as an idea than anything else, the borders are somewhat subjective. I've seen a million different maps of the region, and the only thing they can seem to agree on is that Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia are quintessentially Cascadian territories. According to Ryan C. Moothart, the author of Towards Cascadia, which is one of the only books dedicated to the bioregion, Cascadia, quote, goes as far south as Cape Mendocino in Northern California and as far north as Mount Logan in Alaska. East to west, it runs from the Great Continental Divide in the northern Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It includes the Columbia River watershed, the Fraser River watershed, and the Snake River Valley, end quote. While this map is pretty and all, I personally struggle to believe this Cascadia, as it appears to be somewhat defined by the old idea of Oregon country, irrespective of current borders, cultures, and climates. Oregon and Washington are incredibly divided by the Cascade Mountain Range, which cuts through the states north to south. On either side of this mountain range are two incredibly different natural environments, cultures, weather systems, and physical geographies. Here's how I personally would define Cascadia, with the vast majority of the territory being west of the Cascade Mountains. In my version of Cascadia, you will find a very similar culture, weather, biogeography, and physical geography regardless of where you are in the territory. The issue you're faced with when trying to define this area is that you want to create a unifying culture while still respecting the biogeography. And it's for this reason that I didn't include anything south of Roseburg, Oregon, or anything north of Vancouver Island in Canada. South of Roseburg, the environment becomes too dry, and north of Vancouver Island, the environment becomes too cold, neither of which I would consider to be a part of the Pacific Northwest. Maybe we can call south of Roseburg the state of Jefferson. Cascadia has had its most profound effects, surprisingly, on professional soccer. The Doug flag has been unofficially adopted by the Portland Timbers MLS team, as fans
Fucking
love to
rad.
fly the flag at games and use it as a symbol to support the Timbers. In 2004, the Cascadian Cup was created, being awarded to the best professional soccer team in the Pacific Northwest. As there are only 3 soccer teams in the region, it's always a tight competition between the Portland Timbers, the Seattle Sounders, and the Vancouver Whitecaps. Though there are various notable cities within the region, such as Eugene and Salem in Oregon, Tacoma and Olympia in Washington, and Victoria in British Columbia, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver make up the vast majority of Cascadian inhabitants and essentially control the culture of the bioregion. Known for being very left-wing cities that have some unsightly problems as of late, Cascadia has been a major factor in the US Democratic Party and Canadian Liberal Party's success over the last few decades, though Canadian politics are a little confusing to me, so that might not be entirely true. As these areas are home to some of the most beautiful natural environments in the world, there is a large focus that has been placed on environmentalism and the preservation of nature within the movement. There are 8 national parks in Washington and Oregon, while British Columbia has 7, though both for Americans and Canadians living in Cascadia, the federal governments of both nations feel far away, unresponsive, and sometimes straight up apathetic towards the needs of the Pacific Northwest. While Cascadia has yet to give a real go at becoming independent, many have given half-assed attempts. In 2001, the Cascadia National Party launched a website and then promptly disappeared. On November 8, 2016, a secession referendum was proposed.
All their failures.
Yeah, I think that we missed the end timestamp on that by a bit.
Yeah, I did.
Which is no worries. I think it's just fucking fascinating. And really, when we earlier, it was like, oh, they don't gain traction or they're unable to stay. But that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they have technically that's an international soccer league. If they have, I mean, it's not. They're obviously have their own leagues and structures the way it is. But the fact that they just kind of have this like novelty, like we're going to have a competition amongst ourselves and have a flag, and there's people thinking about how to draw a line on a map, right? Means they're farther ahead than anybody else, because California, and maybe we can talk a bit more about California in part 2. Excuse me. But like California is, if you're like, oh, this is our bioregion, right? How many bioregions are in California?
Dozens,
4, 5, 6, something like that. Many.
I can think of, I can think of more than that. Yeah,
and I really do want to have a conversation about it, because I do think there will be some kind of mix of a kind of region, like a bioregional based state, but also I think that there's room for city states also, right? And just basically autonomous for all intents and purposes, but don't really comprise much more than an urban area. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you can kind of pull up a map of California on, the satellite view of Google Maps, like for example, this.
Yeah.
And you can see that you have bioregions, dark green areas, lots of forest, lighter green areas, agriculture. Then you have, brown areas that are desert, and then, all the coastal areas. Like, it's pretty easy to break up based upon like what goes on in each of these areas.
Right. And as of right now, all of the conversation is focused on, well, we like Republicans and you like Democrats, and you like to rate babies.
Truthfully, neither of us like any of it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, truthfully, like I don't think a whole lot of people who are like pigeonholed into one of the two parties necessarily like them all that much. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Joe Biden, but I got him and I got to put up with it. And like, I don't really like the Democrats. I don't really like the Republicans, because they both don't ever seem to get anything done, even when they have a majority control.
Just build another model, Zach. No,
I have to break this one down first.
Which is a joke, because ultimately, like this structure is designed to not permit experimentation.
Oh, absolutely.
Build another model of a model political party, because it's designed, our entire governance system, our constitutional system of government, it's like designed first past the post and all that other bullshit.
Yeah.
It makes it impossible for another model to emerge.
I'm really interested to see. I'm really interested to see what happens with states that have enacted ranked choice voting in one way or
Mhm.
another. I, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see over the next few decades how those states, progress. Now having this model that, in theory, should allow people to vote for what they want rather than what they're afraid of. We'll see.
Yeah, sounds really good on paper. My understanding
Yeah,
is in practice, it's not really working out so well
unfortunately.
because their people aren't educated on it either, right? Like
Well, yeah.
organizers, and I'm not throwing shade. I am in some of the I don't participate in the circles, but I'm on the mailing list just so I can stay abreast. Um, but yeah, I think they do a lot of education to try and get it passed, and then like government doesn't like it because
Mhm.
it's still because of the way that political power works. It's still kind of like, nope, it's our chosen guy or their chosen guy. There's not really space for this, so they're not really educating people on how it works either.
Yeah, well, and it was interesting to listen to someone who was talking about, like getting sanctioned by the DNC or or the RNC, and it was like, what does that mean? And it's like, well, we don't, let your representatives, represent us basically, and we don't send, uh, you know, um, send anyone there to take interviews or anything like that. And it's like, wow, that seems really threatening if you're in the 1800s or the early 1900s. But like nowadays, I can turn on the TV, I can get on the internet, and I can find out everything I need to know about a party member without ever having to watch them, do an interview locally in my place. So like half the threat is kind of empty, and the other one is just like, okay, so our representatives won't ever be on a committee. It's not a death knell, so maybe kind of fuck you.
Yeah, no, but it is fascinating because how skewed the system is. Because you just brought up something where I was like, oh yeah, that's right. If you don't play ball with the fucking party,
Mhm.
oh, China's Communist Party. Oh, their Communist Party runs the parties run everything fucking here too, dude.
Right.
Like the Democratic Party, at least from what I've seen, you can't deviate from the line they allow you to walk because if
Right.
they do, they can remove you from committee assignments.
Yeah.
How can you possibly represent your district if you're not allowed to do anything except come in and say yes or no?
Yeah. Exactly.
Like you can't participate in drafting legislation just
Right.
because you fucking made the party boss and the donors mad? Fuck
Hmm.
off. This
Yeah.
is why we need a national divorce, but why divorcing based on partisan affiliation at this particular historical moment is such horseshit. Because if we actually want to have a responsive system, it's bottom up, baby. We have to figure out where we draw them lines. We have to figure out how we, administer within those lines, et cetera, so forth. So, at any rate, um, it is an important conversation to continue to have, and we will continue to have it. Did we
Yes,
have
we will.
anything left on that Cascadia, or let's play
That was the end of
some?
the Cascadia. Now we just have Cascadia.
Yeah, so our system is fucked. And like when we think about this, and again, how do we draw the lines? How do we defend those lines once those lines are drawn? What are
Hmm.
the other political factors we're looking at? Well, does it make sense to draw the line here, but we still need to ensure that we maintain a strong economic relationship with a region beyond that line?
Well, and
Where are
that's
the
that's
natural centers?
regardless.
What's that?
The strong economic ties, like that's regardless. Like countries like can't exist without each other.
Right. We all need each other technically, but I do agree with the general sentiment that like we need to have more responsive government. But that's not going to happen by being like my party's better than your party. Let's have a one party system, which is ultimately what they're fucking advocating for,
Right.
right? Um and that's not going to work because ultimately we're human beings and states don't exist. They only
Hmm.
exist as much as we give them validity by participating in the state system because human beings have moved across landscapes since we emerged as an anatomically distinct species 200,000 fucking years ago, right? And those, even the lines we draw on a map change all the fucking time, all of the time. So don't feel attached to the lines on a map, man. Let's fucking figure out how to move forward because, in my opinion, it's inevitable that
Right.
this it can't be held together. It's not stable enough, and there are genuine questions of liberty, which is a big part of our podcast.
Right. I mean, I'd rather have, liberty than security.
Yeah,
That seems to
and
drive a lot of people like, I want security and safety and I'll give up my rights for it. And so you're dumb.
right, and we all know that when liberty dies, it dies with
With
thunderous applause.
thunderous applause. Now let's
Now we're
listen to O
listening to a
Cascadia.
song about Cascadia. It's a national anthem. Again, why there is a legitimately sustained movement for independence in the Pacific Northwest, which I find fascinating because they wrote a national anthem and they have a flag and they have a soccer tournament. Why the
They got
fuck not?
everything.
All right,
All they need
we're
now is
gonna
baseball.
what?
So all they need now is baseball, football, and then they're all American.
Yeah, fuck it. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. We're gonna talk about more shit like this. Join us Thursday. We're gonna talk about some news items. Thursday late night stream, shooting the poodoo at 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Do we do it at 9 or 10? At 9 Pacific Standard Time. Hopefully
Yes, 9 o'clock on Thursdays. Yes.
on Thursday. And other than that, you all have a good week, and we'll see you soon. Finish off
Peace
with O Cascadia. Peace.
Bright burns the sun upon the misty mountain where the woodland waters run and tumble to the sea with the force of your story. Oh, Cascadia, work of the ages, garden of our dreams. Rich grows the wealth when balance and integrity can cultivate good health and foster industry to be diverse as your people. Oh, Cascadia, capable and just, purposeful and green, let us tend to each season, tempered by reason, vested and neighborly, joining heart and hand to be a light among nations when we proclaim our pledge to respect, protect and sustain. Wise be the ways of happiness and liberty when labor and love partake in harmony with a mind for the future. Oh, Cascadia, peaceful the homeland, bountiful and free. Long live a homeland bountiful and free.
Peace out, y'all.